Apparently the level of dissatisfaction with last year's speaker was so high they decided to bring in a professional this year, so we're thrilled to have the congressman. For those of you who don't know the full history of our congressman, I'm not going to give it to you today, but I do want to mention a few things. First of all, I want to assure you he's the real deal. He's a guy who's worked his way up to where he is now and still has a lot further to go, in my opinion. He's a guy who started with a solid education. He got a BS degree, a Bachelor of Science degree from Virginia Tech. That was followed by a master's degree in public health from the University of North Carolina. And then he went on to get a doctorate, a PhD, from Virginia Commonwealth University in public policy and administration. So his academic credentials are absolutely stellar. As far as his career goes, he's served at a number of levels throughout his professional career. He's devoted most of his life to public service, including elected office. He served up in Montrose as a member of the town council, as the mayor for 4 years. He served on the Board of Supervisors, Westmoreland County. He served also, he was elected to the House of Delegates in Richmond. So he's had quite an impressive career, and now he's just been reelected to his 10th year, fifth term in the House of Representatives. And there, he serves on one of the most powerful committees in Congress. All of us who served in the military are very familiar with the House Armed Services Committee. Rob is the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee Readiness Subcommittee, a very powerful and very important committee. Given the state of our readiness today, and I'm sure he'll have some words about that in just a moment. He also serves on the Sea Power Committee, also a committee of great importance to all Virginians, whether you have figured that out or not. What goes on in Tidewater affects all of us throughout the state. So he is in a very, very powerful position to do a lot of good for the state of Virginia. Now, on other issues, I want to tell you that he is a strong advocate, not just for a stronger defense, but he is a champion for veterans, a solid vote for veterans, and highly regarded in the veterans community. I want you to know also that he is a strong opponent of the Iran nuclear deal. And lastly, I want to assure you that he is pro-life, pro-family values, and pro-traditional marriage. So what's not to like? Come on up, Rob. Welcome, please.
Thanks so much. Well, Lieutenant Commander Smith, Carl, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. What an honor and a privilege it is for me to join you today. To first of all wish everyone a very happy Veterans Day. This is a special weekend in our nation for us to take the time to recognize our veterans and the sacrifice and service that they have made to our nation. There's also a couple of other things too that are of note this weekend. On the same day, November the 11th, back in the early 1800s, Virginia Military Institute was formed. So their Founders Day was this year. So Delegate Scott Linghamfelter was here earlier. Delegate Linghamfelter is a graduate of VMI. Little known fact, both Delegate Linghamfelter and myself went to the same military high school in Richmond. We went to Benedictine High School, where we learned that the military discipline that comes with education is a very valuable thing. At that particular point, Delegate Linghamfelter went on to VMI. I went to the Corps Cadets in Virginia Tech, where we had a nice friendly rivalry that still lives until this day. Another momentous occasion that we celebrated in this time of Veterans Day is November 10th was the birthday of our United States Marine Corps. So for all the Marines here, happy 241st birthday. I'm waiting for Bart to shout out a hoorah here. So I see the Semper Fi banner in the back there, so I wish all of our Marines a happy birthday too. But this is a time with all the things that have happened this week to really recenter us about what makes this country great. And it's the principles upon which this country was based. The principles of freedom and liberty, the principles that those come from our Creator, and that a government is there to protect those liberties and freedoms, not to provide those liberties and freedoms. I think that that is absolutely critical today, and what we see with our government is a reminder about where we are in the scope and size of the government, which I think has gone way past what our founding fathers ever had in mind. But another thing, too, we need to remember is that the brave men and women going back to the days of General George Washington that were willing to put their lives on the line to defend those principles that we all hold dear today. That's truly what makes us great. And there's also, I believe, a great uniting element for those principles. And understanding, too, that folks that serve in uniform, that have donned the cloth of the nation, see something bigger than themselves. And that's what makes us unique as a nation, is to look at yourself and say, there's something more than just me. There's a we. And that we truly is about making sure that the world around us is a better place. Not just in the United States, but making sure, too, the principles of freedom and liberty are upheld around the world. And the United States has always done that, and I think always will do that, to make sure that we stand for what we believe is right. So I want to thank everybody here today that has donned the cloth of the nation and what you have done to serve our nation. A deep, deep gratitude that we all have for you and for your service, but also for your families, because our families of the military also sacrifice. As we know, as our loved ones are deployed around the world in dangerous places, many times in combat situations, families back home are a little apprehensive. They are there with some anxiety, understanding what's going on, but also making sure they keep the home fires burning. And that's what makes our nation great, too, is not just the brave men and women that serve, but the families that are there supporting them, and also making sure that other families that look at military service understand what that is all about. General George Washington, it is said that young folks looking to serve in the military look in ways that are directly proportional as to their service in relation to how a nation treats its veterans. Now, if you look that up, you actually find that it didn't quite come out that way when Washington first stated it, but that's the essence of what he said, and that we have an obligation today to make sure that we not only treat our veterans with the proper respect and do the things that are necessary to meet their needs because of what they've done for our nation, but also to make sure that we set the example for future generations that are interested in serving to understand that, it's a reflection on our nation as to how we treat our veterans and how we ask future generations to serve. I think that's an important part, too, of what we should be reminded of this weekend of Veterans Day. We still have a ways to go in helping our veterans. And there are several things that I've been doing to make sure we take that next step. Now, I will give credit where credit's due. The Department of Veterans Affairs has done some additional things that are moving in the right direction, but there are still things that need to be addressed. We have unacceptably high rates of suicide among veterans. Absolutely, we must do more there. We also have unacceptably high rates of homelessness for veterans. We absolutely must do more there. We still have veterans that don't have timely access to care because of administrative delays. We have to do better there. There are also in certain situations where veterans aren't getting the type of care that they need. Now, I can tell you things are getting better, but they are not where they need to be, and we need to do more within the VA to make sure we have an organization that is accountable, that is efficient, and I believe, too, that we need to make sure that they are assuming the right roles in taking care of veterans. I have several bills in that would redirect how the Veterans Affairs Department works. I want to make sure that whenever a member of the military separates or retires, that their medical record goes immediately to the VA. No delay, and that way, whenever they decide to apply for veterans benefits, their information is there with the VA. That, to me, cuts down on the time that it takes for folks to get their veterans card and to have their claims processed. Secondly, too, is many of the claims that our veterans deal with are very complex. They deal with complex medical matters, many times well beyond the scope of mere mortal human beings to figure out how you navigate the bureaucracy. But we do have a great asset. We have a number of active duty military, and in many instances veterans, that are pursuing their law degrees in our universities across the United States. One great example is the Lewis B. Pullard Jr. Center at College of William & Mary. And we have lawyers there in training, lawyers studying to get their Juris Doctor, that have the experience because they've worn the uniform of the nation to help veterans with these claims. And they do that in a pro bono manner, so it doesn't cost veterans a penny to do that. The Veterans Affairs Department ought to do more to encourage schools across the nation that have law schools to provide that pro bono work for veterans to help them in these complex claims. That helps time-wise. It also helps with the dollars that they would have to spend to get that expertise otherwise. The last thing, too, is that we did make changes to make sure that veterans have access to care. That's called the Choice Act, and that is if you're a veteran and it takes you more than 30 days to get an appointment and you are more than 40 miles away from a Veterans Affairs healthcare facility, then you can go to a private doctor. Now, we had to change some of those provisions because the 40 miles was as the crow flies, and we know that aren't many people that get to fly to their to their Veterans Affairs clinic. So we made it by land. I also think we need to incorporate time, because here in Virginia, you may live 40 miles away from a VA clinic, but I can tell you it takes a long time to get there, especially if you live somewhere in North Stafford County and you're trying to go to Fort Belvoir. Many days it'll take you a couple of hours to get there, so time needs to be a part of that. Another thing that's happening today that must stop is the VA is delaying payments to doctors that are seeing veterans on the private side, and that has to stop because that's unfortunately has a chilling effect on those veterans going to those doctors. So I have a bill in that says we are going to break down the walls, the bureaucratic walls, administrative walls within the VA for folks to actually be able to use the choice card and get the services that we have promised them that they will get in a timely way. So those are three things that I think we can do to continue the effort to make sure that our veterans get what they have earned. These are not entitlements. These are a commitment the nation has made to our veterans to say, in return for service to our nation, which we know is an extraordinarily significant contribution, in return, here's what we promise you. We promise to take care of you for life, to make sure that you don't have to deal with health conditions that unfortunately may be service-related or are service-related, that cause you to be in a health condition that could in many ways take away from your quality of life, or in some cases, take your life. So we want to make sure that we are doing those things, standing up to our obligations. Another thing that has to happen today too, folks, is, as I said, with George Washington's focus, is I argue that not only do young folks today look at how we treat our veterans, but veterans look too about how we treat our active duty members today as to how they see our nation going. And I can tell you, serving on the Readiness Subcommittee, that we are far short of where we need to be today with our nation's military. In fact, the things that I get weekly updates on are the things that keep me up at night. The threats we see around the world, whether it is Russia, whether it is China, whether it is North Korea, whether it is Iran, all those situations I think are deeply concerning to me. And then when you throw on top of that radical Islamic terrorism that we see blossoming around the world, that should cause all of us pause. Unfortunately, with things like the sequester, our military readiness has continued to decay. And to put it in perspective, if we are to get back to what's called full spectrum readiness, and that means are men and women properly trained, are they properly equipped, and are we modernizing our forces to keep up with our adversaries, things that we basically have to do just to make sure that if we are in a conflict, that we're doing everything for our brave men and women that are part of that conflict, we fall well short. In fact, we will not get back to a position of full spectrum readiness until 2022. And don't think that our adversaries don't know that. Now, we're doing a lot this year to try to get back to that point, but remember, the pipeline is only so big. This isn't a matter of money, folks. It's not a matter of shoveling money at a problem. It's a matter of how much capacity do we have to actually go through the training? How much capacity do we have to build the aircraft? How much capacity do we have to build the ships? How much capacity do we have to do the research, the development, and the testing for these new systems to keep up with our adversaries? That, to me, is a challenge today. It's one that we continue to work on. When we get back to Congress tomorrow, one of the things that I will be working on, I'm a member of the conference committee that's working on this year's National Defense Authorization Act. That's the blueprint for what our military will do in the year to come and the things that we need to do to support our men and women. That, to me, is one of the most important pieces of legislation that comes out of the Congress each year. In this committee of conference, we work on the differences between the House version of the bill and the Senate version of the bill. And we are, I'm hoping, close to getting that resolved, to get that passed. The President has indicated that he will veto it. I think that should have nothing to do with what we do as members of Congress. Our job is to get the bill done, to get it out of the House, get it out of the Senate, get it through the conference committee, get it to the President's desk, and we will deal with it from there as to what the President does, but it should not in any way, shape, or form cause us to waver in our resolve to get that done. The second big thing that needs to get done is a defense appropriations bill. As you know, Congress passed this ridiculous short-term continuing resolution in the time that we were in Washington prior to leaving to go home. Those things, I think, are extraordinarily harmful. This short-term CR, I think, doesn't get us able in a position to address our fiscal ailments, that is this continuing growing deficit, nor does it allow us to really make sure we have certainty for what we need to rebuild our military. So when we get back, I would like to see us at the very least adopt a defense appropriations bill for the remaining portion of this year to make sure that our service branches have what they need and the certainty to plan and get the things done that they need to get done. Short of that, there's a hiccup there. If we go with this continuing resolution, then all these programs begin to come to a halt. The construction of our aircraft programs come to a halt. The construction of our ships come to a halt because you can't institute any new spending under a continuing resolution. Now, I think continuing resolutions are an abdication of our responsibility. I vote against them because I've said I'm not going to continue to do the same thing expecting different outcomes, because it's not the way for us to run a nation. We have to make the tough decisions about what should get funded and what shouldn't get funded, not kick the can down the road, and a continuing resolution is merely kicking the can down the road. Let me talk about two other things, and then I want to go to your questions. There's a fundamental element of what I think has to happen in Washington. And we go through years and years of back and forth, and I, like you, get frustrated because things that have to get done don't get done. And to me, it's pretty simple. It's time for members of Congress to take the responsibility and to bear the sacrifice if the work doesn't get done. So it's pretty simple. And I have several bills in, and I will put them back in again in this Congress to try to force that issue. First of all, we should get budgets done on time. April 15th of each year, the budget should be done, and if it's not done, not a single member of Congress should get a paycheck. Period. Period. Secondly, once the budget's done, we have 12 appropriations bills that have to get done. I believe they should be done by the end of July. We have this ridiculous, archaic tradition called August recess. This year we left Congress left Washington for 7 weeks. 7 weeks. Knowing what we had left, we only passed 5 of the 12 appropriations bills. How many businesses or folks leave their business to go on vacation with all this work yet to be done? With critical work that would be critical to keeping the doors of your business open, would you leave and go on vacation for 7 weeks? You wouldn't do it. I have a bill in called the Stay on Schedule Act. I call it the SOS Act. It says this: you will not leave Washington until all 12 appropriations bills are done, and that must be by the end of July. If not, no August recess, which is essentially vacation, none of that until that work gets done. Period. Straightforward. Additionally, no paycheck. So I want to make sure that members are willing to put their vacation and their paychecks on the line to get the work of the nation done. Because I can tell you, that is a major factor, I believe, in pushing members to actually put aside their individual preferences, their individual interests, and replace that with the interests of the people that elected them. To me, that's absolutely critical. And take an example. You have a state like California that went through years and years and years of not getting budgets done, and the government not doing the things that it needed to do. In this situation, California decided we're going to do the same thing, put in place a no budget, no pay provision. 5 of the past 6 years, California has gotten a budget adopted on time. Now, folks, let me tell you, if California can do it, we can do it in Washington. So I want to make sure we're doing fundamental things like that, again, to make sure that Congress is responsible and Congress is making the sacrifice if things don't get done. And then I think you have this emphasis to say, okay, let's make sure we take our ideas, put them together, and actually get something out and get it out on time. You know, it's the last time we actually got all 12 appropriations bills done on time was 1992. So you can see how recalcitrant the Congress has been through the years in not getting its job done. So I think we have to go back to that. I haven't gotten nearly as many members of Congress interested in signing on to that bill as they should. But I'm hopeful in this time that folks will indeed stand up and say, I'm willing to be there for the right purposes. I'm willing to put my paycheck and my vacation on the line, just like everybody else across this nation has to do in their job or in running their business. To me, it's just common sense, and I want to make sure that that happens. I think if we do those things, we can get back to actually what we swear to do. We raise our right hand to swear to uphold and defend the Constitution, and one of those responsibilities is to make sure we do the business of the nation, including providing for this nation's defense, which happens through this process. So I am hopeful with that in the weeks to come that we will be able to get that done, and when we get back to Washington, hopefully finish out this year, get our National Defense Authorization Act done, get the appropriations bill done, especially for our nation's defense. And then I look forward to what I believe is a great opportunity in the 115th Congress with our opportunities to get some things done that I know folks across this land want to see get done. And at the top of that list is making sure that we are putting our military back together in ways that we know absolutely have to happen. Folks, a strong military allows us to do this. A strong military allows us to make sure that the world around us is a safe place. Because I argue you would not see the aggressive behavior today by Russia if the United States had a strong military. You would not see the blatant disregard for sovereignty of nations around its borders and in its waters that we see with China. You would not see the outright aggression by North Korea in the development of nuclear weapons. You wouldn't see Iran completely disregarding a quote-unquote deal if they believed that there was a consequence to that. And all of that stems back to a military that doesn't have the capability that it needs, and I believe the lack of resolve to say if we say something, then we mean it, and there's a consequence if things aren't followed the way we direct them to be followed. That, to me, has to happen. If we have a strong military, I believe it prevents conflict. We all know the bully in the playground. If the bully in the playground believes that they can assert themselves over somebody and that they can win, they will continue to act in a bullyish way. If not, the bullyish behavior goes away. I believe that having a strong U.S. military makes for a safer world, and that is what I believe our focus needs to be. So, folks, with that, again, I deeply appreciate you inviting me here to celebrate Veterans Day. I want to thank all of the veterans in our audience today. I see our ROTC cadets are here. Cadets, thank you. I was in ROTC both through high school, JROTC, and ROTC all through college. Thank you for your willingness to go through a structured regiment to learn what leadership is all about. That says a lot about who you are as young men and the young women that are part of that program. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So, folks, with that, I don't know if anybody has any questions. I am glad to answer your questions or do my best to do that. Yes, Michael.
One of the concerns that I have, and I would like you to address it, is what's it going to take to restore the unity and vision within the Republican Party?
Great question. The question is, what is it going to take to restore the unity and vision within the Republican Party? I believe that this election will go a long distance in bringing those different ideas together. And I do think the Republican Party has to look at the results of this election and understand that there's an element that has been missing in what the Republican Party has done, and that is there's a vein of populism that has occurred now in electing Donald Trump. I think we have to be mindful of that and look at the parts of the population that feel that they've been left out by both parties that have expressed that interest in electing Mr. Trump. If we do that and we say, what can we do to make sure that we are working in the best interest of middle-class families who feel left behind and folks that see these issues that need to be addressed, the things that have resonated with what Donald Trump has put forward, things like addressing illegal immigration, addressing border security, rebuilding our nation's military, making sure, too, that we take systems that don't work, like the Affordable Care Act, and repealing and replacing them. I believe people want to see government work, but they want to see it work in the right ways, and they want to see that there is a benefit to them in their lives, and what they have seen doesn't make them feel like they are in a better place. So I think that we have to learn from that. We do have a ways to go as a Republican Party, but I think taking the lessons learned here are going to be extraordinarily important. And I do believe that there is an element of divine providence in what happened in this election. I do believe that the Lord puts people in certain places at certain times for certain purposes. And while Mr. Trump may not fit the standard vision of what we have as a Christian, I do believe that he can be the conduit for good and to get the work of this nation done and to really, I believe, bring us back to the fundamental elements of liberty and freedom that has made our nation great, and that really, I believe, will propel us into the future in the way that we all know this nation needs to go. Sure. Yes, sir.
You answered my question.
Well, I agree. The question is about fleet security with our ships, not only in port, which is where the USS Cole was attacked, but also at sea. I couldn't agree with you more. I've had conversations with Admiral Richardson, who is the Chief of Naval Operations, about naval rules of engagement. Historically, we've seen things that have happened that should cause us all pause. We saw the 2 U.S. Navy boat crews that disregarded every level of protocol about those boats leaving, every level of protocol and practice on defending those boats, what they did to allow themselves to be boarded, the disobedience of orders there. All those things, I think, are very, very problematic, and the Navy absolutely has to address those. That's a microcosm, though, of what we see happening in that particular region. Another element, too, is on the larger scale, what are we doing with our surface fleet to make sure we're protecting our surface fleet? A great example, again, it goes back to rules of engagement. We see Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen firing C-802 Chinese missiles, essentially silkworm missiles, which are anti-ship missiles, at our U.S. destroyers, the USS Mason, the USS Nitsa, on October the 9th and October the 12th. We didn't fire back and take out that missile site and that radar site until October the 13th. Now, what kind of message does that send to wait that long a period of time before we respond back? It sends the wrong message. I think rules of engagement need to be such that not only do you put in place those protection measures on the ship, those defeat measures on the ship to make sure the missile doesn't do any harm, but then immediately understand that there needs to be a reaction. And if not, then what happens again, we have subsequent acts of aggression by the Houthi rebels there in Yemen. And again, remember, all these are efforts to probe. What's the U.S. reaction going to be? What's the U.S. reaction? What's the U.S. reaction? And if the reaction is delayed, that is a weakness that our adversaries will exploit. So I couldn't agree with you more. I've been in discussions with Admiral Richardson because I do believe that our rules of engagement, especially there in the Arabian Gulf, provide a higher than necessary level of risk. It's a risky environment to begin with, but whether it's the Straits of Hormuz, the Arabian Sea, wherever it may be, it's a dangerous place. If we are not immediate and direct in our response to these acts of aggression, they will only accelerate and they will only create greater risk for our sailors in that region of the world. Carl?
Rob, our national debt now exceeds our GDP.
Yes.
Interest rates are historically low, and that has helped keep the debt service down. As interest rates rise, and they will, debt service as a function of, as a percentage of our budget is going to rise.
Yes.
And within only a few short years, it will exceed what we're now paying for defense.
Yes.
If Trump wants to cut taxes and increase defense spending, will that exacerbate the debt?
Well, I think there's several things that he has to do along with that in order to really address the debt. As you pointed out, we pay today about $380 billion a year just in interest on the national debt. Not a penny of paying back the principal, just the debt. And our interest rates are essentially at zero. So it's easily conceivable that that could double. As you know, we spend about $600 billion a year on our nation's defense, easily outpacing that as part of our budget. I agree, it is very, very problematic. If Mr. Trump is to address this, I think he has to do several things. If we take a step back and separate fiscal policy from monetary policy. Fiscal policy is what we do in the United States as far as how we spend our dollars, and we know that has an impact. But monetary policy is what the Fed does to try to look at what the impact of the U.S. dollar has on our economy and the interest rates that go along with that. We normally go through an 8-year cycle of prosperity and then into some type of recession. Well, we're right at the precipice of that normal 8-year cycle. What does the Fed have to do to affect monetary policy? It has no place to go unless it goes negative interest rates, and we all know the impact of deflation and negative interest rates. You know, you're not going to pay people to borrow money. So that being said, I believe the place that we need to go as a nation in the way to stimulate the economy to make sure we offset any effect of rising interest rates is twofold. First of all, is you have to do tax reform. You have to do tax reform both for the individual and the corporate level. Corporate level needs to include this. Bring down the corporate tax rate to at least the median of what it is around the world, which is 24%, at the very least. And that way you keep dollars here, you prevent many of these business inversions where these companies go overseas. Simplify the tax code, take away many of the exemptions and loopholes for those businesses so small businesses are paying much closer to what big businesses are paying. You do that, you actually increase economic production. Another thing, too, is to do away with the repatriation tax. There's a tax that has to be paid if you have a subsidiary of a U.S. company and you want to bring those dollars back in the United States. Apple Computer is a great example. Apple Computer doesn't sell a single iPhone or Mac or any of their items that they produce through Apple USA. They sell them through Apple Ireland. Ireland has a 13% corporate tax rate. They also don't bring their money back in the United States. They actually issued bonds recently to fund improvements with Apple USA because it was cheaper to borrow money than it was to bring their own money back in because they have to pay the difference between the 13% in Ireland and the 35% here in the United States. So do away with the repatriation tax, or at the very least reduce it to a much, much smaller level. All that capital comes back in the United States. If you look to what we need to do is we have to do a massive reform and reduction on the regulatory side. I think if you do that, it would be another renaissance in our economy. Think about this today. If you add up just the cost of federal regulations, it totals $1.9 trillion out of a $19 trillion economy. That's 10% of our GDP goes to comply with federal regulations. Now, I want to make sure the playing fields are level. Some of those regulations are there for a purpose, and they're there for the right purpose. But there are many that are not. If you would go through and not just do reform, but if you would do reduction, go through and look at those things and said, is this necessary? And if it's not, why do we have it? Let's get rid of it. That would be another way for us to reinvigorate the economy. If you just did away with half of that, that's an additional 5% of GDP. And that should happen at every level of government. If you were to add up the total cost of local, state, and federal regulations, it would be equal to the 9th largest economy in the world. It would be just less than the country of India. We can do better than that. And that, if you talk about a renaissance, if you want to talk about a stimulus program, what can the government do to stimulate the economy? It can do regulatory reform and reduction. It can also do tax reform to make sure that we are competitive with our corporate tax rates to others around the world. That's the way that we can offset any effects of what will happen, both with a regular cycle of the economy, but also what would happen too with interest rates going up. Those are the things, Carl, I think we can do. That's the best way for the government to really help the economy rather than believing that more government spending helps the economy. Yes?
If I may ask a
Sure.
follow-up, Rob. Those are all terrific suggestions. Several of them will take time
Right.
to produce results. In the first year of the Trump administration, do you think the House will accept a larger deficit than we had this year?
That's a good question, because whatever you do initially is going to not go into place first. So if you do tax reform or those kinds of things, you won't see an immediate impact of that. What I think has to happen, and what we have asked to happen with the Office of Budget, and for them to get to us the proper perspective, the Congressional Budget Office, is to dynamically score what those impacts will be. What they do right now is they statically score. So they look at it and they don't give any credit for what these policies will do to the economy, the increase in the economy. I think if you did that, you could actually not worry about as much the issues about the deficit. But, Carl, we absolutely have to address the deficit. That's one of those things that's out there. It continues to have an impact on private economy, also on interest rates because of the amount of money that we have to borrow, the bonds that are issued in order to take on that debt. So I would say the way to really look at that and to determine the impact of these policies is to make sure, as we have done, is to allow this dynamic scoring so you can actually put out there and say, let's measure the effectiveness of this and make sure, too, that it's not adding to the deficit. Or if you can't estimate that, then what you have to make sure you're doing is reducing spending likewise elsewhere to make sure that you offset that. To me, that has to be part of it. And the biggest part of that, too, is that if we are truly going to do the budget reform that we need to, you have to address the autopilot spending programs. You cannot go without addressing Medicare and Social Security. And we can do that without endangering people's benefits today that they've earned and that they're relying on. But if you're 55 years of age and younger, there has to be a change to Social Security and Medicare. It will not exist on the current track by 2030. And the trustees tell us that. That's not something Congress says. So if we're really going to get after this and get to the spending side of things and address the deficit, those things have to be on the table. One thing that Congressman Morgan Griffith and myself are working on in this next Congress is to change the rules of the House. Another archaic practice in the House is that when the House goes to adopt a budget, under the rules, we cannot include 2/3 of the budget. We cannot include Social Security or Medicare as part of that. That goes back to Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan when they made the last changes to Social Security, when they made age eligibility changes, when it went from 65 to 66 and a half. What they've said is, we're going to close the door now. You can't talk about that again. Those rules have never changed. We're going to do everything we can this year to change those rules, so when we adopt a budget, it will actually include not just 1/3 of the budget in the discretionary spending side, but it will include the 2/3 of mandatory spending or non-discretionary spending. That's the only way we're going to get our arms around the budget and really, truly reduce this deficit. And there's some simple solutions that we can put in place there that, we talked about getting the job done. They're bipartisan solutions that are there. Age eligibility for folks out in the future. People are living longer today. Life expectancy is 79 years. Eligibility is 66 and a half. When Social Security went into place originally in 1932, eligibility was 65. Life expectancy was 68. In those days, 30 people were paying in for every one person collecting a benefit. In the next year, the ratio goes to 2 to 1, 2 people paying in for every one person collecting benefit. It's a simple math problem. We have got to do that. But Carl, if we do that, and we should do that, and I'm convinced that we will do that, we can get our arms around the deficit and the debt. Yes, sir.
What kind of numbers do you claim to be fighting with your concept of control in the Congress? Do you get serious support, or are you just trying to develop?
Now, I think we have serious support for that. If you look at where we are with discussing these issues, I think folks on both sides of the aisle understand the reality of where we are. And those are simple solutions that don't require massive amounts of political back and forth, because these are things that people can plan for and that have a true impact on the longevity of Social Security. And they've been done in the past, so it's not like you're reinventing the wheel. Another thing that has to be discussed, in addition to age eligibility on Social Security, is another simple math problem. Today, premiums into Social Security are capped at $118,000 of income. So no matter how much you make over that, you pay the same premium. Yet the benefit that you receive is not capped, is not scaled based on how much you pay in. It's a simple math problem. Either uncap the premium or scale the benefit based on what's paid in. You have to manage this program like a defined contribution plan, not like a defined benefit plan. I mean, we look at all these defined benefit plans out there now that through the years, the math on them gets more and more difficult and in many instances impossible because you're relying on more people paying in. And when the people paying in gets equal to or less than the people taking out, the math doesn't work. So that's why you have to manage these more as a defined contribution program and say, listen, what you put in is going to be pretty equal to what you get out, and that way we can actually manage them in a fiscally responsible way. And I do think that there's growing support for that in the Congress. And to me, it is because it's a simple math problem. It's hard to go back home, and when you use the 55 age year cutoff to say you're going to be impacting your mom and dad's or grandma and granddad's benefits, because you're not. And for those folks 55 years of age and younger who today have a very low expectation about what they'll get out of Social Security or Medicare, they can financially plan for that in whatever happens in the future. What people have told me across the spectrum is, Rob, stop lying to the American people about what they can expect out of these programs. Start telling them the truth about how you're going to manage them to make sure that what you tell them in the statement they get is actually going to come to fruition. Because when you get that statement today from Social Security, you know, it is not a truthful statement. I mean, it tells you what you can expect, but it doesn't tell you anywhere there that the money's going to be there to fulfill that promise. We've got to do a better job, because if not, when those folks that are saying, hey, I'm doing my retirement planning, expect that money to be there, after 2030, it's not. Now, it doesn't go away to zero, but it drops off pretty precipitously, and that's when you really get into problems. And if you wait that long to fix it, the fixes are so problematic that you're almost going to have to do, you know, to really look at other ways to achieve that. Any other questions? Yes, George?
You just mentioned defined benefit and defined contribution. What are we going to do something about the former President's Act? Right now, they elect the payroll of Social Security. They've got presidential libraries.
Yeah.
These things have gotten way out of control.
Yeah.
Many individuals probably get a Social Security or Medicare payment that shows, because they happen to sell a little stock or something, their adjusted growth went up a little bit, and they get penalized by that. So former presidents can make movies.
Yeah.
And I don't see any legislation that says, this is why I make movies. That's great. America's all about that. But you shouldn't be living in a palace.
Yeah.
Pay for and travel. They don't go to get around at the airport. They have their corporate jet lined up at the general aviation.
Yeah.
Why can't we amend that act? We didn't have it for 50 years.
Well, George, we can, and it is time for us to re-examine that, just because of what happens today in presidents leveraging their position as president afterwards and the dollars that obviously they put into a variety of different places. But I think you have to ask that question. You know, they're allowed to have staffs that are paid for by the federal government. You know, obviously I understand the Secret Service provisions there because they still are in a prominent place. But I do think it begs the question about how much is enough and how much is too much. And I do think that you have to ask the question, how much is too much, especially in light of what presidents have done to leverage that. As you know, for their libraries, they're supposed to be raising private dollars for that, but there's also a public element to what goes into managing and maintaining their former president operations. That's right. They're running it with federal dollars. So it does beg the question of how much is too much. Oh, I know. Well, there's so many ways that former presidents can leverage their time in office in other ways. You know, I want to make sure that they're getting, you know, the basic provisions. But we haven't seen of recent time any U.S. presidents that have suffered in financial destitution. So, no, that's for sure. So, yes.
Jumping starting off on a different topic, how difficult do you think, from a House perspective, is it going to be for Mr. Trump to get his nominee through the Supreme Court approved and sitting with the other eight?
Well, I think in the Senate side, they'll go through the hearings. I know that there'll always be some pushback no matter who he nominates, but I think that what Mitch McConnell did to make sure that that didn't occur before the election was a stellar move, and exactly what needed to happen to make sure that you set the stage for what will occur in the weeks to come. I think where Mr. Trump can be most effective is he has to, right out of the gate, announce who his nominee is. And then what he's got to do is to make sure the Senate provides enough time for the nominee to go around and meet with folks, and then make sure that there is sound Republican support for that nominee. And the good thing is he's announced those nominees well beforehand, so I believe that he's already set the stage for people to know who they are. You haven't heard a single person come out and say, no, I've got problems with that, which I think is a good signal for the Senate. Now, it's going to be up to Mitch McConnell to make sure he helps navigate that process so we don't end up with a Robert Bork type situation. But that I believe he has done in making sure that the nominee didn't come up previous to the election. So I feel good about where that is. All we can do on the House is to watch and let our ideas be known and hope. That's right. But we can communicate with members of the Senate to make sure too that they are standing strong behind the president's nominee to make sure that they get the nominee through. Sure. Tony?
Here's an easy one.
Yeah.
An easy place to go with your $500 million. Defund Planned Parenthood.
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. Well, I think you'll see those continued efforts both in the House. I would say the Senate, but for whatever reason, there's a few folks that have some ambivalence in the Senate on that. I don't know why. To me, it's a no-brainer. We should completely disconnect any federal dollars going to Planned Parenthood. Money is fungible for all these folks that are saying all the other things that Planned Parenthood does. We know the main function there is the taking of lives, and that is not what any of us believe should be happening, and certainly the government should not be paying for that. Yes?
I happen to be an adopted father, and probably others in here the same way, and you feel very, very bad. But that means you can eliminate
Yeah.
those.
Well, I'll tell you this, folks. I am very, very passionate about this. To me, it is personal. I myself am adopted. If Roe v. Wade were in place back in 1959, I may not be here. So I tell folks, for me, it's personal. Why we as a nation don't do everything we can to make sure that we are helping mothers in unexpected or crisis pregnancies, to make sure that we help them along the lines, to make sure that we connect them with families that are looking for children, to me, is a reflection as to who we are as a society. So to me, the place you can find agreement is to ask folks on the other side of the aisle, why would you, and we heard Secretary Clinton create no separation on when she thought it was unacceptable to take the life of a child, or take the life that we know is a life. And to me, why are we placing the same emphasis to say we're going to be supporting these mothers that find themselves in this situation? We know it's tremendously impactful on them, but we also understand too that there are loving families out there that these children can go to, where they will be loved for a lifetime and can go on to productive lives. And to me, that's a reflection on who we are as a society. I mean, it really is. It's a reflection as to who we are in our heart and souls, and it's something that we can't walk away from. We have to stand strong on. And I will adamantly disagree with folks. Again, as you heard, I'm a biologist by training, and I will adamantly argue with anybody as to when life begins. And folks will talk about all the things that government can do if you believe that life begins at conception. I believe that it does. And that is absolutely how we must treat this, and it's absolutely how we must be in there to create policy around that. And with that, I believe we must make sure that in the years ahead that we do everything we can to make sure we stand for life. This is not a choice. This is about protecting life, and it's a reflection of who we are as a society. Protecting life at every place, where it begins to the place where it ends. And if we don't do that, then I think we lose something of who we are as human beings. So. Yes.
I have a question, I have a statement. I'm one of those people who truly believe that this was divine intervention. I think that maybe God looked at our Congress and our Senate and said, I've got somebody, I call him my Apostle Paul. I think
Yeah.
that's a good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
I think it would be very wise for the Congress and the Senate to take heed, not so much let anybody be out of control, because none of us agree on a whole lot of anything. But we see our country deteriorating in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I think that God has allowed this through these United States to take place outside of our government to give some fresh thoughts coming out. I think if there's more control from our government, we won't have this rioting and tearing down our buildings and places of work in some of these states. So I think our government's got to take a stronger, get rid of government waste. We always, because we listen to all of this and we complain. Because what are they doing up there? Why are
Sure.
they allowing this stuff? So we need a stronger Congress and a stronger Senate.
Yeah.
And we need people to come together to work.
Well, I agree.
I do think this is divine, and I think it's an
Yeah.
opportunity.
Well, I agree. I do think there's divine providence going on here. I do think the Lord puts people in certain places at certain times for certain purposes. But it's also a charge, as you said, to those of us in Congress to make sure that we are getting the job done, to make sure we understand the magnitude of what we face, and that we listen to what the American people have said. And certainly there are differences, but whenever you have these elections, there are differences. There are people that are disappointed, would like to see different ways to go about the business of the nation. For those folks that want to protest, if they want to do it peacefully, that's well within their First Amendment rights. But those that want to do it in a violent way or in a way that destroys things need to have the law fully enforced in those situations. So we're a nation of laws, and I want to make sure that we follow those, and those localities that do not fully enforce it, I think, do their citizens in this nation a disservice, because if you don't do that, it can quickly spiral out of control, and that's not the place that we need to be. Yeah.
A lot of places.
Yeah.
And when you hear that this group who has allowed this or is sponsoring this other group, Answer, who apparently has communist leanings, and yet they are getting the same monies apparently, or not monies maybe, but the tax breaks or whatever as charitable, true charitable churches and places. I don't understand that at all, how this group could possibly be allowed to get away with this and be called a charity.
Yeah, well, I agree. Those institutions that have those types of connections, the Congress, specifically the Government Oversight and Reform Committee, needs to look into their tax exempt status to figure out if their efforts are truly eligible for tax exempt status. We know that the IRS has looked at many other organizations as to whether or not they should have tax exempt status. Just fairly enforce the IRS laws, not just on those organizations that you may not like, but on every organization that exists here in the United States, especially if they're pursuing political activity or they are in violation of the law. Pretty simple. I do feel that the emphasis within the Justice Department under Mr. Trump will be more about enforcing the law and less about politics, which is what I believe it's been here recently. So I want to make sure that we see what truly is the intent of the Attorney General, and that is to fairly and in an unbiased way enforce the laws of the United States. Bart?
I just don't have a question.
Yeah.
I just want to say how lucky we are to have Congressman Wittman as our member. And I can remember when I just started my company, and I thought I was a big shot. And, I'm going to get a meeting with the member of Congress, and he's very gracious. And when you come to Rob's office, I mean, it's stacked with people every day that he's there. And he graciously spent about an hour with me, which was outrageous. But all the things he's got, it is crazy. There's 435. What a guy. This is the hardest working guy in the Congress. And anyone would tell you that. And he's just amazing. We thank you.
Oh, Bart, thank you. Thank you, folks. Thank you. Well, folks, thanks again. It really is an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. It's a true honor and a privilege to represent you. Please continue to stay in touch with our office. You know, elections can be contentious, but I tell folks, you know, I want to make sure that we are there representing everybody. And that means I want to make sure we stay in touch, that you give me your thoughts and ideas about what needs to happen in our nation. To me, they're pretty simple and straightforward. But the solutions and the good ideas don't exist inside that 90 square miles of fantasy land we call Washington. They're right out here with what you deal with each and every day. So it's a blessing to be here with you. I wish each of you God's blessing. May God bless our great Commonwealth of Virginia, and may God bless our United States of America.